You're live.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the first Liberty Bells live stream that's been set up by the Liberty Bells, and I hope it's working. We are with Joanna Williams. She is an academic at, is it the University of Kent, Jo?
Not really, only one day a week now, and even then not for much longer, so that's a bit of a myth.
She's also the education editor of Spiked and
That's
an author. Her latest book is called Women versus Feminism. I would like to say thank you, Jo, for this book. It's absolutely fantastic. It's incredibly and well considered, and just like to show you my copy. It's already well dog-eared, and it's bound to get increasingly dog-eared over the years as I return to it.
Well, thank you so much. That's really nice of you to say.
Okay, so where shall we begin? I suppose it's a big relief from the kind of voice of women complaining that we usually get in mainstream media and in gender politics literature. Why do you think it is that that voice is so prominent, and why is it that you don't sit well with that?
Yeah, well, I think when I was growing up, I always thought of myself as a feminist, because to me, being a feminist meant that you were strong and powerful, and that you could take on the world, and that you would be equal to any man in being able to do whatever you wanted to do. And I think gradually over the years, it's kind of sunk in that feminism today really means something quite different. And I think we've got the perfect example of this at the moment, with this panic that's going on over sexual harassment. And it's got to the stage where I just don't even want to turn on the news anymore, because all of these stories coming out about sexual harassment that seem to conflate, like 15 years ago, someone put their hand on someone's knee, someone told a bad joke, somebody touched someone's bum in a lift. All of these things get conflated with rape and really serious accusations of sexual assault. And I mean, I think the first most important point to make is that this really trivialises these serious offences. If you've been raped, you need to go to the police, not to Twitter or to a secret WhatsApp group. You need to be going to the police. But by creating this narrative where every woman can count themselves as a victim of sexual harassment, because let's face it, we've all heard jokes, we've all been involved in banter, so we can all count ourselves, we can all say me too, and it just makes me feel so uncomfortable, because it presents women as really pathetic and incapable of coping with the world. So it's really great to see that Julia Hartley-Brewer has come out in the news today and said that when somebody put their hand on her knee 15 years ago, she was quite capable of turning around and saying to him, "Do that again and I'll slap you." And that was the end of the story. And why this should be dredged up now, and it just seems all intent on reinforcing this view that women need to be treated like children. And I think I think it's damaging to men, the idea that a political career or a theatre career or whatever career you've got can be ended overnight just because somebody somewhere remembers something that you did 20 years ago. And I think it's just as damaging to women, because we get presented en masse as being these really pathetic creatures.
And where do you think this is sort of coming from? From my perspective, I think there's two things going on. I think that part of it is what you've called intensive parenting. you know, and Jordan Peterson and Camille Paglia were kind of talking about the same topic, and they were saying that with parents having their children older, they're putting an awful lot more effort into these children, and about the children not learning how to manage their lives themselves and having a model from childhood of always having an authority figure to go to. And I think that there's also an element of victimhood being attractive, because if you fail in your life or at things, you have an excuse. And if you do well, then you've done really well because you've overcome all of this stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I think both of those two things are really important. But I think especially the second one that you said about victimhood being attractive nowadays is a really important point, because if you can present yourself as a victim, then you get access to platforms, you get access to power, and I think more importantly, you get this kind of moral beatification where no one is allowed to question what you say at all. So if you're a victim, then all everybody else is able to do is just believe you. And I think this kind of onus on everyone to just believe the victim. You're not allowed to ask any questions. You're not allowed to raise any criticisms. All you have to do is just believe when somebody presents themselves as a victim. And you can see how on one level that is quite seductive. You've got this power where you're completely beyond criticism and you're on a platform above everybody else in society because of having that victim status. And I think this really becomes an important point at this moment in time where we have the rise of identity politics. And so much of identity politics, it seems to me, is premised upon these kind of competing claims to victimhood. So who can make the biggest claim for victimhood? And I can't remember who now, but it's been called a kind of oppression Olympics, or a kind of competition for victimhood status. And I think what's really interesting, and one of the things I really hate about feminism is that it takes the preoccupations of a very small elite group of privileged women who are actually doing really well for themselves, who actually, are doing fantastically in careers, in pay, in all areas of life. And it allows that group of really privileged elite women to claim a victim status for themselves when actually the reality is anything but.
Can I just jump on with a question? You're in your book, everything that you're talking about, the way that modern feminism privileges experiences, victims, and you have no one has any right to disagree with their experience. What you do in the book, which I haven't seen very much of, I haven't seen very many other people doing, is you really go into the academic kind of journey that feminism has gone down, that has enabled that, and you really go into kind of what are these academic theories that have allowed them to arrive at that. So I guess my question is, you're somebody who works within academia, and so I guess part of my question is, how have you found that? Have you found a lot of pushback against that? Has it affected your career? And also, what work needs to be done within academia to be another voice, to give you? Because I suspect that opposing view is very much missing within academia.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the fact that I kind of said right at the beginning that I now only work one day a week at the university kind of shows that this really has had an impact upon my career. I think the way academia is set up nowadays, there is a definite, well, my previous book was called Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity, and that's how I would describe it, that there is a really strong political consensus around certain issues, and I think feminism is definitely one of those issues. And if you criticise some of these key concepts, then it's not impossible to do that, but it certainly makes your life more difficult, and it makes developing an academic career more difficult. But I think the way in which directions in academic work really enhance identity politics is this idea that comes from second wave feminism, really, which is that the personal is political. And I think that was very much taken on board by feminist scholars to kind of put forward the view that women have different ways of knowing than men, that there's kind of you have a special status as a knower, you have special insights into the world if you are a woman. And I think what's really crucial that connects with what we've just been talking about is that this special status, this privileged status, is premised upon experiences of oppression. So the more oppressed you are, the more privileged your insight is into the way the world works. I mean, on the one hand, this is just so ridiculous, because what it would mean would be that kind of famous scientists, Einstein and Newton, were the most oppressed people in society, and they'd only been able to make these scientific discoveries because they were so oppressed. And we know that's not true, because when you try and understand scientific theories, mathematical formulae, that's not dependent upon your subjective position in the world. It's not dependent upon your status as somebody who's oppressed. These statistical facts, these scientific theories for understanding the world hold true no matter who understands them, no matter who argues that particular point of view. But because they kind of make this claim that knowledge is dependent upon individual standpoint, and your insight is premised upon your own experiences of oppression, it kind of really plays into this idea of identity politics, that we all know the world in different ways, and that we are kind of constructed ourselves, our own identities are constructed mainly through language and through the words that we use to make sense of the world.
And
does that answer? Do you think that answers the question?
I kind of feel, because when I was reading your description of all of these theories and how they came to make these conclusions that they've made, part of me was thinking, oh my gosh, you've actually kind of, by giving this, by repeating all of these so-called academic arguments, which are just complete and utter, like they're just mind-boggling. Do you feel like having to treat them as if they are kind of sensible arguments? How did that feel? Kind of. Another question. You talk a lot about the circularities and the contradictions of feminism, and I know certainly when I think about all of those, it makes me want to bang my head against the So how did it feel when you were going into all of this stuff? Were you kind of thinking,
I mean, in a way, but I mean, you have to be patient in a way, and you have to go in to explore these things, because the fact is, an awful lot of very intelligent people think these things as well, and I don't think people kind of just like suddenly wake up one day and think, you know what, I'm gonna think really nice things today. And I think they kind of go on a journey that starts, I mean, I think Elizabeth made a really good point, about the kind of over-intensification of parenting. So if you take somebody who's at university nowadays, for example, it's probably their first time away from home. They're being quite protected before they get to university, and then the lesson that they've learned already from school and probably from their family is that if somebody says something nasty to you, then that's the end of the world, and that you can't just turn around and say, hey, those are just words, I can argue back against you, but you have to be really deeply personally offended and take it really seriously if somebody insults you. And I think when that's your starting point, you're taking that approach with you into your academic work, and you're look, when you read other theories and other ways of understanding the world, because that's your starting point, you kind of see this as a personal attack rather than just seeing it as another piece of scholarship or a different point of view. It becomes interpreted as a kind of existential threat to who you are as a person, to your very identity. You have to double down, if you like, on your claims to victimhood to reinforce who you are in the world, to kind of carry on being the person who you have said you are. If that makes sense.
And I guess that kind of describes, I think, probably the feelings that many feminists have when they read people who are disagreeing with them. So I guess I have a question about, if we might say that it's very unfair for people who already have a outlook to be using their academic work kind of, it's activism, it's not academic work. How can people who want to contribute to the other side, how can we kind of try and contribute and study things and write things that and try and stay away from that trap? But we do need to disagree with this kind of. What kind of areas can we work on? What kind of advice I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think that's an easy thing to do at all, but I think one thing that I've tried to do in the first few chapters of my book is to actually look at some of the statistics around education, around pay, around women in employment. And I think if you can not just show the statistics, but also put those statistics into some historical context. So I think what's really upsetting me at the moment about the discussion around women at work and sexual harassment is that some of the freedoms that women have today to work as equals to men, not only have they being hard-won freedoms, but they're actually quite historically recent freedoms as well. So you don't have to go back that far, maybe just to the 1950s, the 1960s, to a time when the gender pay gap was a real thing, because men and women would be employed in different jobs on different contracts. You know, if you were a teacher, there were separate staff rooms for men and women, separate pay scales for men and women, separate teaching unions, and these changes were perfectly legal. You know, your employers could pay men and women differently, quite legally. They could do that. And for young women growing up, the idea of curfews when they went to university, of single-sex accommodation, even of chaperones, believe it or not, for young women university students. You know, these ideas are not that far behind us. And I think there's a real danger, if we don't have any appreciation of how far women have come in such a short space of time, that we end up going back to that age where we have, so I mean, you can see it was in the news not that long ago, feminists celebrating the Friends actor David Schwimmer because he offered a film critic a chaperone for the meeting that he had with her. And feminists like saying, hey, isn't this wonderful? David Schwimmer, what a gentleman, offering this woman a chaperone. Well, who wants a chaperone? You know, I would like to think I could meet with David Schwimmer without being accompanied by a chaperone. And then there's a real danger that we end up turning the clock back on some of the great progress that women have made. So I think we need to be able to say things like, look, 70% of all women work nowadays, 90% of all graduates are in work. If you look at the top three professions like lawyers, doctors and vets, in each of those top three professions, there's now more women than men in those professions. There's more female MPs now in Parliament than at any other time in history. And I think we need to be able to say these things and remind women, you know, we need to be celebrating. Isn't it great that there's more female MPs than ever before? Whereas instead, if all we ever do is say, oh, being a woman is so terrible, it's so awful, it's just this constant barrage of sexual harassment, young women growing up today, like my daughter, you know, not going to think, oh, great, I'll go and take a career in politics. They're going to think, why on earth would I want to do that? Why on earth would you want to work somewhere that's so horrible and oppressive? So I think we need the statistics, but we also need to be able to put the statistics into kind of historical context as well.
Yeah, I think your chapter on the pay gap was the best thing I've read on the pay gap, actually. It was so comprehensive, and when you pointed out that, you know, kind of jobs, all the CEOs and kind of, you know, managers and whatever have been working there for years and years. In fact, from a time when there was barriers to women's employment. And so, you know, now we've got far more women in these workplaces. At some point in the not too distant future, that is going to start leveling out. But I mean, you know, I think that the workplace and the university, I think these trends are really concerning, you know, and especially in the university in terms of the search for truth and justice and things like this. But what really, really concerns me is the kind of feminist aggression that we see in primary schools and secondary schools, because, you know, people have no choice but to go to these places, and they're also going there at very impressionable ages. So I wonder if you could talk about some of the things you've seen in your life and found out about in your research, and what kinds of effects you think.
Yeah, definitely. First of all, just a quick thing on the pay gap, though, because I think for me, the pay gap is a really, really good illustration of how pitching everything, as feminism does, pitching everything as a kind of battle of men against women is really unhelpful, because if we haven't, and again, it's also a really good example of how feminism takes the concerns of a small and elite group of very professional middle class women and kind of exploits working class women to better the lives of the already privileged. So if you look at jobs that pay the minimum wage, you know, jobs such as cleaners, people working in shops, you know, really low paid factory work. Well, for those jobs, men and women both earn the minimum wage, and there's actually zero pay gap, because if you're being paid the minimum wage, it makes no difference if you're a man or a woman. Both men and women are being paid the minimum wage, and if women who are on the minimum wage want to earn more, then they're much better off working alongside men who also earn the minimum wage to argue the case for higher wages. And they actually have far more in common with those men who are also being paid the minimum wage than they do with the women who are working as CEOs and you know, the managerial positions and in the professions, who earn so much more than them. And the whole gender pay gap discussion really misses that point and actually goes against, I think, the interests of people who are on the lowest level jobs. But just
to jump in there, I thought it was a really good point you made about companies being forced to publish their pay gap statistics, when you said that actually what that's going to encourage them to do is not employ women in minimum wage entry level jobs. You know, that they very well, you know, you probably need it if that's the kind of job you want, because it will make their statistics look bad.
Definitely.
So it's actually going to end up disadvantaging the kind of most vulnerable women.
Absolutely. I think that's really important. As soon as the government makes some policy like this, I think it immediately builds perverse incentives in, and it immediately backfires. Another way in which that could backfire is that at the moment, women can and men can ask to work part-time when they have children. I mean, it's not an automatic right, but you do have the right to be able to ask it. And for various reasons, and we can discuss why, but for various reasons, lots of women do choose to work part-time when they have children. And that's something I think which we should celebrate. And I would argue that if all people had better paid jobs, and that would be a choice which would be available to even more women and men. Everybody should be able to have the right to work part-time if they want to when they have children. And one big way in which this could backfire against women is you could have a child, go and see your boss and say, I'd like to cut my hours, keep doing the same job, but I want to work part-time. And if your manager's thinking, my gender pay gap, how's this going to look if you now only work part-time and earn half as much? That's not going to be great. And they could end up saying no. And women could lose then that flexibility, which some women have been lucky enough to enjoy so far. So, yeah, I'm always really wary. And, I think the same thing we've got to be very careful about at the moment with the sexual harassment scandal, because government and workplaces are being put under so much pressure to bring in new laws and regulations to kind of outlaw sexual harassment. But again, I think there's already some evidence that this can seriously backfire against women and men, but against women especially, because there's some research that shows that even now men have got far more cautious about having informal meetings with women in the workplace, that the kind of lunch meetings or after work drinks, where whether we like it or not, we could argue against it, but it is the case that it's in those informal settings often that promotion opportunities are talked about, networking takes place. And if the workplace becomes so regulated that women are excluded from those opportunities, then that's not going to be in the best interests of women. I mean, also, one thing that we've not heard anything about in the past week is the fact that actually a lot of women and men meet in the workplace and go on to get married and form relationships. It's one of the kind of top 3 or 4 places where couples meet. And again, this idea that you have a really hyper-regulated workplace where those kind of informal interactions are not allowed, I just think it's going to be to the detriment of everyone.
Yeah, absolutely agree. But yeah, can we go back to kind of feminism in schools?
Yeah, definitely.
I'm a mother of primary school children, and it's not just feminism. There's other kind of ideologies that are creeping in there too. Big concern.
Yeah, definitely. I think this plays out in a number of different ways. And again, the thing that always strikes me in some of the discussions around feminism is the disjuncture between the kind of the rhetoric of the feminist campaigns and the actual reality of what's taking place. So the fact that girls are doing so much better, I mean, not just a little bit better, but phenomenally better at school than boys, is often overlooked. And I was saying earlier that some of these developments are quite recent, but the success of girls at school, this has been going on for a long time now. So it's kind of 25 years, a quarter of a century, that there's been more women than men going to university. And now, most recently, it's 55% of young men go to university. 55% of young women go to university, compared to only 43% of young men. And that's really quite a phenomenal gap. There's significantly more women than men going to university. And this is across all subject areas, maybe with the exception of like 2 or 3 subjects like computer science and engineering. But it's really across the full range of the disciplines. And yet, we don't celebrate this. We so rarely hear this stated and celebrated. And what happens is feminism instead, it seems to me, looks for more and more obscure areas to be able to say, look, girls are still at a disadvantage. So they focus on, physics or chemistry so that they can point to the one or two subjects where girls are not outperforming boys. So rather than saying, isn't this brilliant, girls are doing so much better in medicine, in veterinary science, in the science subjects that lead most directly to careers, instead there's this focus. So I think even at a very young age, girls pick up the message that they are at a disadvantage. And I think that's a problem, because I think it could put girls off going into science if all you hear about is, oh, sorry, I've lost you.
Oh, we've still got you.
Oh, have you? I can't see you anymore. Sorry, there. Sorry. I don't know what happened. You just completely disappeared. Sorry. Yes, I think that's one problem. We don't celebrate the success. We tell girls that they're still disadvantaged. And I think that's one way that feminism plays out nowadays. But I think there are also some far more explicit ways as well. So campaigns particularly around things like domestic violence and sex and relationships classes, where girls and boys are taught quite explicitly, it seems to me, that girls are potential victims in waiting, and boys, men, are aggressors who need to somehow be controlled, and made to feel bad about being male, even at a very, very young age. I think this message creeps in that boys at school are a problem. They can't sit still, they run around too much, they've got too much energy. That subtext takes place in the very early stages of the primary school. And then you add to that these kind of explicit lessons that can teach, like I said, about domestic violence, about sex and relationships, teaching even very, very young children that men, their fathers, their brothers, are people to be feared. And I think that's horrible for young boys growing up to get that message from school. It's completely horrible. And I think it's also really terrible to tell girls that they should be scared of members of their own family and their own classmates. And I think, again, you can see how this really continues when they go to university, and you have all these kind of campaigns against lad culture at university, which it seems to me often just means working class young men.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems to me, I come from a working class area, and it seems to be behaviour that working class girls engage in as well.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, it's sort of, I find the whole domestic violence campaigns incredibly disturbing. And I mean, I've had kind of my own child, who I know you've mentioned somewhere about the Pants campaign, which was, is it NSPCC?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, and so that was basically about teaching kids that their private parts, their genitals, are theirs and nobody should touch them and stuff like this. And my child came home from school, aged about 6, and when he was getting dressed, he became really self-conscious to cover himself up. And I thought, I can't believe this has been brought into my house. They've disturbed him, and he's kind of grown out of it now, thankfully. But I think, it's a really horrible, unnecessary loss of innocence for most children. And, I think that teachers are more than capable of looking for warning signs in children who are acting, out of the ordinary, and being able to deal with them one-on-one without having to take all of these little children and feeding them these scary messages.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I completely agree with you. And I think one of the problems we have nowadays is that you've got this kind of blurring of the boundaries between the role of school and the role of home. I mean, I personally, I completely agree with you. If there's a child who is showing signs of being withdrawn or tells the teacher of some particular problem, you'd like to think that the individual teacher would completely do everything that they could to help that child on an individual basis. Why it is the role of schools to be awareness raising around the issue of domestic violence, I really don't know, and I don't see how and why that should be the role of the school at all. But I think it's really interesting because I think this does undermine parents, and it does make parents far more conscious about what they do, but not in a good way. It just stops you behaving naturally and informally around your child. It's like there's a little voice in your head that tells you that you're being constantly monitored, and this puts an awful lot of pressure on parents to kind of behave in the perfect way. I mean, I think that risks sounding bad, because obviously I don't mean that people shouldn't be good parents, obviously, but there just isn't a kind of textbook one right way to raise a child. There isn't a recipe you can follow that says, feed them this, this and this, get them to go to bed at this time and wake up at this time, and everything will be absolutely perfect, because people are in different family situations with different children. And the fact is, parents know their child and know what their child is capable of dealing with far more than any teacher. So I remember when my boy, he's now 19, I remember when he was 11, and I knew he was having sex education at school. And I kind of prided myself on being this really progressive mother, and I told him everything about sex that there was to know, and everything was so cool. So when he came home, this was when he was in year 6 at primary school, and I said to him, so as a joke, I said, did you learn anything you didn't know already? And he said, yes, oral sex and masturbation. And I was quite shocked at that, because I just thought, wow, why is the school teaching my son about oral sex and masturbation? Was it really necessary in the context of sex education for him to be taught about these things? And I'm sure there were a couple of children in the class who asked questions, perhaps, who did want to know about these things, but I felt as if I knew my boy better than the teachers, and I knew what he was ready to deal with and what he could handle. And I think he didn't actually need a formal lesson in oral sex at the age of 11.
Absolutely.
With our last couple of minutes, we have had a couple of questions on the live chat. So the first question is, was there any resistance or pushback or difficulties in getting your book published?
Yeah, I mean, I did try probably about 4 or 5 publishers, and then I was really, really lucky to meet Philippa Grand at Emerald, who just seemed to understand what I was trying to do. And yeah, it was definitely something that I found more challenging than I have done with previous books. Some publishers were quite explicit and did say to me, we couldn't publish a book like that because it contradicts some of the titles that we've already published. So if they were publishing books by, say, Laura Bates, Caitlin Moran, they'd say, we don't want to publish a book that appears to challenge work that we've already released. So because that kind of dominant feminist narrative is out there, if you do want to write something that's contradicting or challenging that directly, I think it is definitely more difficult. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it definitely is more difficult. And just trying to get people to understand why what you're saying is important. And I think the thing that worried me was that people thought that I was kind of arguing something, that women should be kind of forced into burqas and kept in the home and, never allowed out in public on their own. and to try and make it clear that I wasn't arguing for that. I was actually, to my mind, arguing something which is far more liberatory than what feminism at the moment is actually offering us. So now I was really lucky to find Emerald, I think, and have them understand what I was trying to do.
And that's great. I guess we've come to the end of our time. I just want to say thank you so much, Joanna, for joining us for this interview and also for writing your wonderful book.
Thank you.
Women versus Feminism is published by Emerald Publishing, and it's available on Amazon as a paperback and also as a Kindle edition. So please, everyone, rush out and buy a copy of Joanna Williams' wonderful book.
Thank you so much.
And is there anything else, I guess, you want to talk about or that you want to add?
I don't know, you've baffled me now.
To be honest, there's so much. Could we have you back another time?
Definitely, it would be an absolute pleasure, a real pleasure. It's so nice to speak to you both.
Any questions, leave them in the comments and maybe we'll have Jo on another time and be able to put them to her.
Definitely, that would be great.
Very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.